Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this Risk Minds webinar in partnership with SAS. My name is Naeem Siddiqui. I lead the Climate Risk Initiative here at SAS as a senior advisor in the risk division, and I'm going to serve as moderator for this event today. Before I start, I'd like to remind everyone that we do have time reserved at the end of the webinar for Q&A. You can send in your questions at any point during the webinar using the Ask a Question box on your screen, and we will try to get everyone's questions answered. There's also a resources box at the bottom of your screen where you can download assets and additional reading material. You can also resize your screens if you need. Now, let's get started. So as regulators announce climate risk stress testing initiatives around the world, banks are asking the question, what does this mean to me? I know a lot of you have done this, and while these tests involve timelines, data, and models different from what we are normally used to, they're not currently being used to set capital, for example. The expectation is that banks will incorporate climate risk into their day-to-day decision making, including lending. Having spoken to many bankers, I know you're looking for ways to deal with this and find out what's happening in the industry, how leading banks are planning, and how you can do this in the least painful way. So today we'll talk to a central banker who dealt with the data for climate risk stress tests, a banker who is part of the leaders pack from the UK, as well as industry consultants helping out. So let's meet our panelists for today. So Tina Imambaksh is going to be our first speaker. She is in the climate risk stress testing team at the European Central Bank, which she joined as a master's trainee and since then has been responsible for data management and data infrastructure of the ECB's first top-down economy-wide climate stress test exercise, which of course many of you are interested in. Next, we'll have Doug Baird. Doug is the head of climate risk analytics and pension risk at NatWest Group, where he most recently led the delivery of the NatWest submission for the Bank of England climate stress test. You'll hear the experiences of a guy who's gone through this exercise, so that'll be interesting. And lastly, we have Martin Roja, who heads up our risk banking solutions at SAS Institute, including our stress testing solutions. His team has been helping banks globally deploy modern, efficient stress testing infrastructure, and he will share some of his experiences with us. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all here with us today. So let me start with you, Tina, because everything starts with data, right? So you were involved in with the ECB stress testing exercise and helped deal with the data. So tell us about your experience. What sort of data did you use? What were the main challenges? Go ahead, Tina.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, Naeem. I'll be very happy to share some details with you. And to begin with, I'd just like to quickly outline the framework and the main elements of our climate stresses to make sure that everyone in the audience is on the same page. So we've run a top-down economy-wide climate stress test that is based on two main pillars. The first one being climate scenarios. And these are essentially projections of the economy into the future. Like the time frame that we use is 30 years. And they're based on model outputs from the NGFS. And the NGFS stands for Network for Greening the Financial System and is a conglomerate of international central banks that work very closely together with climate scientists to generate these economic projections. Then our second big pillar is the unique highly granular data set that we've created, where we mapped the financial information and the climate risk information of firms to the loan and security portfolios of euro area banks. And I'll go into detail about the data just in a second. But before, I'd like to explain how we use these two pillars to conduct a stress test. So we've developed novel models where we account for the transmission of climate risk into the financial risk of firms. And these models are climate specific because we account for the certain risk drivers stemming from climate change and their impact into firms' balance sheets. So, for example, the damages from natural hazards. Sorry, apparently my audio voice is cracking, so I hope it is better now. So I hope you can still hear me. I will continue. So we account for certain risk drivers stemming from climate change. So, for example, the damages to physical assets of firms due to extreme weather events, or the impact of higher energy costs to the operational costs of firms. Then, thanks to these risk drivers, we first stress test the balance sheets of firms, and which we're then also able to translate into the credit and market risk of euro area banks.
So, Doug, let me move to you, and then we'll come back to Tina afterwards. So your bank, Doug, went through the UK stress testing exercise, which again, a lot of global bankers that are with us today are looking at the UK as somebody to emulate, because you guys have already done the test. So tell us about your journey. How did you go about building capability to execute the stress test? What can you tell our audience? What can they learn from you?
Yeah, thanks, Naeem. I better just, given the technical gremlins, is it all okay in terms of sound?
We're good.
Good, right,
We're
thumbs
good.
up, excellent, right, good stuff. Yeah, no, so first of all, yeah, like Tina, delighted to get the chance to speak today. Yeah, as you were saying, Naeem, we're kind of literally in the last week completed the first phase of the Bank of England climate stress test. So that was the main submission, which was about sort of 12 plus months of work. So it was a very material and strategic project for the bank. There will be, in all likelihood, a phase 2 in the early part of next year, and the Bank of England will be looking to publish results in sort of early second quarter next year. So what I'll do is maybe just give a quick overview of the kind of context of the stress test, because it's relevant, because I think one of the key things here is it's a learning exercise for everyone. We're kind of all on this journey together, and the Bank of England's clear that they are learning as much as obviously we are as the participating banks in terms of what works well, what doesn't work so well from a methodology perspective. So I'll give the context of the actual exercise, but that's not to say that's necessarily going to be every aspect of that will be the way that this is done going forward. And then I'll talk about kind of what were the key learnings, the kind of battle scars that we've got through the process, and what were the things that worked well, didn't work so well. So in terms of the stress test itself, it was set as a 30-year view, given also the climate nature of it. Tina talked about the NGFS scenarios. So again, they leveraged the NGFS scenarios for that, looking at 2 transition risk scenarios and a high physical risk scenario. And it was really focused on credit impairments. So it was a static balance sheet and looking at how the losses accumulated on the banking book over that 30-year period. So the traded market risk element was de-scoped. And in terms of sort of, I guess, there's a number of unique characteristics about all of this, but one of the key ones was a focus here was the kind of bottom-up or asset level analysis. So really looking to understand what are the risk drivers at a individual corporate level or an individual sort of property level from a real estate perspective, and that's differentiating it from obviously traditional stress testing and indeed probably some of the previous climate stress tests, which were much more on a sort of top-down macroeconomic basis. So that's a quick overview of the process. So in terms of the exercise, so in terms of the key areas I'll touch on in terms of what the challenges and learnings were, it's kind of 4 of them. So one's around you can't have a climate webinar without talking about data. There's definitely one around data, one around the kind of models and methodologies, one around wider infrastructure, and then one around really how do you get confidence or comfort in the actual outputs. So in terms of the data, I think, like I was saying, it's so fundamental to this, and obviously not just fundamental to scenario analysis, but fundamental to what banks need to do more generally from a climate risk perspective, but also from a kind of opportunities and understanding their own financed emissions perspective. They're all sort of basically the same data pool that feeds all these different use cases. So we did spend a lot of time at the start understanding, what's the lie of the land with our own data. And there's very obvious emissions in terms of emissions data, as well as data around physical hazard risk and specific data on corporate or retail property types and energy efficiency. So looking at what we've got, what is potentially available from third-party data sources, what's our strategy for direct engagement with our counterparties, because that's another key requirement here as we go in this kind of climate risk journey, and what are the gaps that actually won't be filled because they're more fundamental and need to be worked on over the coming years. So that was the first phase, making sure we got all that clear and started the process of actually bringing that data in, beginning our client outreach project to make sure we were engaging with our customers and understanding their knowledge of their own climate situation. Related to that then was the models and the methodologies. So again, we were very clear that we wanted to, I guess, build an expertise in-house. I'll hold my hand up. I'm not a climate expert scientist that's been working in the climate space for years. I've been in a number of areas within the bank, and I think that was very intentional that we wanted to upskill the people and bring in the right resource, and also partner with the right third parties where necessary. But fundamentally, there was a lot of the modelling methodology that had to either be built or brought in from third parties. And also looking at, as I think you were saying up front, which I agree with Naeem, which is obviously I think having a big regulatory stress test is a very powerful and good way to drive activity. But it was, again, we were very clear, and I think it's very important to make sure that you're building capability that's got that longer term use case. So it's not just to fulfill a specific regulatory stress test, but it's really that the stress test is just driving the capability build. But you're clear on what the use will be beyond that in terms of, like you said, building into wider credit decision making, pricing, potentially even into capital. As you said, that's likely to be coming downstream. And then in terms of actually bringing those two things together, what's the actual infrastructure? How are you going to bring this data into the bank in a controlled manner, making sure it integrates with your wider processes and systems, meets all the requirements? How are the models going to be hosted? How does that whole through process going to work? Especially if you're bringing in potential elements of the modelling from third parties, how is that going to work? What's the model validation and risk infrastructure around that? And then finally, sort of moving off the, I guess, technical operational side and back to the actual analysis side is how, once you've got the data and the models and it's all set up, how on earth do you get comfortable with what those models are spitting out? And there's obviously no magic answer to that. But we adopted a sort of multi-pronged approach in terms of combinations of really comprehensive and detailed review and challenge with stakeholders across the business, model validation, external benchmarking and discussions with peers where possible, and other, looking at academic research, etc., to try and gain that comfort as we go through it. But it's by no means is this about getting the right answer. It's about going through the process to help people start thinking through what are the risks, what are the risk drivers. And so probably just wrapping up in terms of sort of building on those thoughts and what were the kind of key learnings. I think probably two related ones. The first one is that we adopted which I think worked really quite well, a kind of agile approach to it. So we didn't wait until we thought we'd had the perfect solution before sharing more widely within the business. We went through a number of iterative builds of capability, looking at progressively broader portions of the balance sheet and progressively, more sophisticated, in inverted commas, approaches to the modelling, and shared that, and sought input from all across the business through the usual areas, but also from potentially parts of the front-facing business that wouldn't normally get involved in stress testing, but needed to upskill anyway on climate risk. So it was a really powerful two-way process. We got their insights into the sectors and the subsectors that we're looking at, but they also, we were able to leverage this to start upskilling them on the thought process around climate risk drivers, and this whole sort of scenario process, but also with senior stakeholders as well. Because, like, I'm sure there's other people on this call are familiar. Climate is such a hot topic, an important topic, and these kind of exercises are, like I said, normally quite a focus for senior stakeholders. There's a lot of interest, so keeping people abreast of how things are progressing all the way to the top of the house was another very effective sort of tool that we used over the last 12 months. And I think the final thing, just sort of concluding on all, but drawing these points together, is just trying to avoid an excessive focus on the technical details, because there is a hell of a lot of technical details. There's a lot of technical details in the actual interesting climate science side of it. There's also a whole lot of technical details and challenges in just the operationalizing of it. But trying to keep that under control and help people understand what's the actual big picture from this, and what are the insights that can be gained, and how does this help both from a risk management but also from a strategy perspective, which it absolutely did. I mean, obviously I can't go into details, but there's been a lot of value come from this exercise for NatWest Group. So I'll conclude there. Thank you,
Doug. And you're I mean, I'm glad to hear the one. It wasn't an exercise just for stress testing folks, but you made it into an enterprise-wide exercise, which is exactly where it should be, because it is going to impact everybody around the bank, validation, etc. Great, great input, Doug. Thank you very much. We're going to try and get back to Tina to see if she will continue what she started with. Tina, are you with us?
Yes. Can you hear me now better?
Yes, it is better. I'm going to just take you back to the slide.
Sure. So first of all, apologies for these complications. Hopefully now my voice will stay stable. So I'm just going to continue where I stopped. So in terms of the data that we used for the ECB climate stress test, we had two main streams of informations that we combined. So firm level information on the one hand and bank level information on the other. For the firms, we first collected data on the climate risk of firms, which we define as physical risk and transition risk. And for physical risk, we used physical risk scores that we obtained from 427. And they measure the frequency and intensity of different types of natural hazards to which firms are exposed. And they estimate this exposure based on the addresses of firms' facilities. And just to give you an idea of how granular the data is, we use several sources of natural hazards, namely wildfires, sea level rise, and flooding. And for sea level rise, they measure the exposure with a precision of up to 5 meters between a firm's facility and the sea. Then for transition risk, we use both absolute and relative emissions of firms, which we obtain from the data provider Urgentum. And this climate risk information we then combine with the balance sheet information of firms by leveraging on data sources Orbis, Icon, Bloomberg, and IBACH. And this firm level data we then map to the loan and security holdings of Euro area banks. And here we use ECB internal data sets. So for loan level information, we use AnaCredit, and the security holdings we obtain from SHS. And finally, we end up with a sample of around 2.3 million firms with focusing on Europe. And we can say that this data set is exhaustive because we cover around 80% of the total Euro area loans that are held by around 1,600 banks in the Eurozone. Now, as you can imagine, the collection and the combination of data didn't come without certain challenges. Before starting to collect the data, the first challenge that we had was to determine how to measure the physical risk of firms. And here the problem is that physical risk is most commonly measured only on an aggregate basis. So either on a country basis or most commonly on a continent basis. And the solution that we had here was to collaborate with 427. And the only information they needed from us was the geolocation of firms. And based on that, they were able to determine their physical risk exposure with their own climate risk models. And thankfully, we were able to obtain the addresses of the firms from Orbis, from where we also obtained the balance sheet information. Then the other big challenge we had was related to the transition risk of firms. And here the problem was that actually not a lot of firms disclose their emissions. And this is especially the case for private firms and for SMEs. And the solution that we found here was to use a statistical model that was developed by Urgentem, with which they're able to infer the emission intensities of firms by using the size of the sector classification of the firms. And this was very helpful because we were able to get different types of emissions from them, so both direct and indirect emissions. And also in terms of scope 3 emissions that come from the supply chain of firms, and they were able to give us a very rich source and different type of categories of scope 3 emissions that firms emit. And scope 3 emissions, just to note, is very essential to have to get the true carbon per footprint of firms, given that it's usually the largest part of emissions that firms have as an output. And then finally, the last challenge is maybe not only a data challenge, but more also of a conceptual challenge, namely the question of how useful historical information of firms' climate risk are for determining the future climate risk of firms. And the solution that we got here is to leverage on the projections of the NGFS to combine the historical data that we had on firms on their physical risk and transition risk, and to translate it into a forward-looking perspective. So NGFS provides future emission pathways and the future expected damages due to extreme weather events. And combining this with the, on the one hand, emissions of firms, and on the other hand, with the physical exposure of firms, we were able to get a forward-looking perspective of the exposure of firms to climate risk for a period of 30 years, which is, by the way, the longest period analyzed in a climate stress test so far. And just to give you an idea, what we were able to find out with this rich data set that we've created. So on the left-hand side, you see the average emissions of European countries and by sector. And here we're able to see, okay, across countries, there are actually not countries that are more or less emitting than others. But across sectors, there's actually a large variation. So understandably, resource intensive sectors such as mining, electricity, or manufacturing, they're higher emitters compared to others. And on the other hand, for physical risk, as you can see under the map on the right-hand side, we were able to really disentangle the firm's exposure to extreme weather events by different type of hazards. So we were able to find out, for example, that companies located in central parts of Europe and in northern parts are more exposed to flooding, whereas firms located in the southern part of Europe are more exposed to wildfires. So this really helped us to determine the full distribution of climate risk to which firms are exposed.
Excellent. Thank you, Tina. That sounds like a very interesting, intense, but interesting exercise, and it's generated some questions from the audience, which we hope to get to towards the end. So let me get to you, Martin. We've heard from Tina's experience and Doug's experience of going through this whole exercise. So how do the best banks set up their infrastructure to be ready for this? Can technology make this process less painful for them? Martin.
Thank you, Naheem. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I have interacted with a few banks around the world on the topic, and as Doug already mentioned, obviously there's a number of challenges regarding where to get the data, how to relate the data to our own data or the bank's own data, etc. But that's where technology starts to having its role. Meaning, Tina talked about the need for the exercise to prepare those statistical models. Obviously, there is a step to define the models, to estimate, so on and so forth. But then there's a step where you apply the models and get and get the results, aggregate the results, organize the reports, so on and so forth. So there's a clear need to have technology supporting the process. Now, when we look at one-time exercises, you can obviously be more ad hoc on the technology that you use. I mean, you can pick and choose, maybe be a little bit more manual on some of the steps. But of course, as we move forward to a more repetitive process where banks will be required, one, to do stress test exercise more frequently, to monitor their own portfolios on a regular basis regarding how emissions evolve, to make decisions in terms of what kind of profile they like to have on their portfolios. At that point, I mean, they need automation in place, and that automation will obviously come from making sure that the technology is providing that automation. So we are looking at not only data management type of technology to be sure that you collect the data, that you organize the data, that you relate the data with the different pieces. Like, for example, we talked about, I mean, we have to collect data, geolocated data, climate geolocated data. Then I need to have my portfolio also geolocated so I can connect my corporates, the corporates that are on my portfolio, with the geolocated climate data. Same thing goes for emissions, where probably also need to take into consideration the industry, the sector they operate. There's not yet a lot of detailed information, so in many cases you have to infer based on models. So obviously technology needs to glue all these pieces together and ultimately provide an environment that for the different bank stakeholders to slice and dice and prepare reports, understand profiles in the portfolio, understand trends going forward. So whether it's the regulatory stress exercise or it's just an internal managerial exercise to understand the investments that the banks want to do. In any case, technology can definitely help automate and provide the right set of information.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Martim. Well, let's move on to hearing from our audience now. Let's move on to our first question, the first polling question that we have. And if you want to put that up, please. So the first question we have for you, the audience, is this. In what areas do you see yourself using the results of the stress testing exercise in the next 12 months? I know we have, I'll let you answer the question and we'll discuss the results, but I can see there's been a couple of questions on this already from the audience. And this is, again, one of the things that banks are most interested in terms of, where is this leading, right? Where is this going to impact? How am I going to use the results of all these stress testing exercises that I'm doing? So let's give our audience maybe about 15, 20 seconds to answer the question. And then we'll have a quick discussion around them. So there are a lot of different things that banks are looking at. Obviously, there are investment decisions. Where am I going to invest the bank's money, especially with things like the green asset ratio being talked about in Europe, things like net zero commitments being talked about, and greening of portfolios, for example. There's obviously lending for corporates, SMEs. Am I going to use the corporation's physical risk or transition risk rating in lending today? There's policy and direction, of course, decarbonization. There's infrastructure or software. That's an interesting one because some banks went through this exercise of doing the whole stress test, as Doug described quite well. and then they found out what worked and what didn't work based on some of the stuff that Martin was talking about, and they used the results to make the infrastructure better, right? Modernize all of those things. So let's look at the results and see what our audience has said. Very interesting. So policy and direction seems to be the big one. Lending, of course, and investments in green assets with net zero coming in fairly close. But it doesn't seem like anything is off the table. But of course, policy and direction was the big one. So let me pivot from this to asking a bit as to interpret this a little bit. And let me start with you, Doug. You did all of this stress testing and you saw the results of what our audience thinks. How do you see the results of your stress test being used internally for decisions like the decarbonization or lending, perhaps? Where do you see things going from here?
No, it's a good question. I mean, it's definitely the sort of first step on the journey, and part of the CBES process itself was looking at what the strategic response of the banks would be. So, although it was that was effectively a sort of hypothetical exercise, we had to go through that process rigorously, and that, again, without going into details, that you can imagine that then actually has, which is the intention, proper implications for actual current strategy. So I mean, in short, it absolutely is. It's not the sole driver, but it's definitely a increasingly important part of the decision making. I mean, I think that's got to be tempered to a certain extent by the recognition that these are all first generation models and so on. So this is not around, like I was saying earlier, getting precise numbers and making decisions off those precise numbers. But I think much more what we found is it's our first kind of quantitative way of maybe backing up what we qualitatively thought was maybe the right thing to be doing. And this is both from a sort of strategy, but also from a risk management perspective. And then I think if where do we go from here? Then I think it's certainly from the sort of risk angle. There's definitely how do you take these data sets and this capability, be it the stress testing or just more general scenario analysis, but that kind of quantitative lens on physical and transition risk, and start building it into the wider sort of ecosystem, if you like, within the bank. So be that risk appetite, limits, pricing, all the way through. Ultimately, like we were saying earlier, it will start to feature as part of the regulatory capital landscape, I'm sure, in the coming years. But then on the other side, if you think about sort of, obviously there's what could the climate do to our balance sheet, but there's also what does our balance sheet do to the climate. So the whole work, which I'm sure most of the people on this call will be doing, certainly NatWest Group are doing with our financed emissions targets. How do we start looking at our flight path for our different sectors, our carbon budget, and start making decisions based on both the kind of emissions implications as well as the other implications for revenues and profit. And that involves forward-looking scenario analysis, just like it does on the stress testing side. So I think, lots of use cases, but we're sort of at the start of that journey, and it's kind of quite an exciting time to be involved.
Very good. And let me give a follow-up here to Martin. The expectation is, of course, that the stress testing results are going to be integrated into decisioning for various types of decisions of the bank, some of which Doug just talked about. Is that integration exercise into your everyday banking decisions an issue at banks that you've talked to? Can technology help here?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, we are all in a learning phase. Exercises will change, not in terms of the purpose, but in terms of the let's say the steps they go through. So and each result that you pick or the PRA, EPA, etc. Look at will be incorporated on the next exercise, right? But at the end of the day, it will end up always in the same type of logic, meaning you need data, you need scenarios, you need some models in a way or another to get to and understand the impacts of climate and impacts of emissions on your portfolios and your overall position of the bank. And then obviously you need to look at the results and aggregate, disaggregate, report, etc. And of course, as Doug was pointing out, you are not doing this for the current story. You probably are doing this in a forward-looking way. So the point is, first and foremost, you need to be sure that you capture the data. Now, one piece of capturing the data is from today on, when you do new origination, so when you are lending, and it's interesting that the second most voted answer on the poll points to that, is that when you capture the information for the new lending, the new originations that you are collecting, you need to start collecting information that will help you then relate with the climate change, with the emissions, with the different ESG type of aspects. So you need to understand, if you are lending to a corporate, the corporate needs to tell you what is their strategy, what is position, where they are located, so on and so forth, right? What kind of assets they have, and so on and so forth. So I think that will be one of the first impacts on technology, meaning every system that is now collecting information for new originations will have to be adapted to collect also this information. The other piece of the story is, as we were mentioning before, is that technology will have again to be updated to collect data, the scenarios, the data from the climate, the data from the emissions, so on and so forth, on a regular basis. So then you can have the sources of data well established and automated, and then you can, with the new characteristics and categories that you are collecting for your assets, your counterparties, you can relate those, and you can start automating the process itself, right? So I think, I mean, it's not like we will have a specific piece of technology just for climate risk, but obviously there is impacts in the different technology process that firms use to be sure that the climate, ESG, and so on, it's covered.
Great, thank you. And I agree. I think certainly climate risk is going to be an extension of the use case for existing stress testing, for existing modeling capabilities that banks have. But I also think this is going to cause a lot of modernization and then the creation of efficiencies at bank, just as Basel II created created a need to be more efficient of things like modeling and feeding into capital systems. So Martin mentioned the word, and Doug as well, forward thinking. So let me get to Tina. So if you're going to do a little bit of forward thinking, what is next with your ECB stress test work? And how does this relate to the ECB bottom-up stress test that's coming up next year, I believe?
Sure. So actually, one of the plans we have is related also to climate risk metric, just as discussed by Doug and Martin. So we would actually like to leverage on the results of our climate stress test to develop novel climate risk metric that combine both climate risk and the financial risk of firms, and which ideally decision makers in the financial system can use for the transitioning of their business models to carbon neutrality. Because when you think of a currently available metric, most commonly known, the one where you use emissions and divide it over the loans of firms. So this gives you maybe information on how financial system finance pollution and is useful from a policy perspective, but it doesn't include the inherent financial risk of firms or the creditworthiness of firms. So ideally, we can also contribute in that sense for decision makers in the financial industry. And for the climate risk stress test, we plan to update our methodology and the data infrastructure by integrating the second generation of NGFS projections, because they will have a further refinement. Instead of having continent level projections, this time there are country level projections. So we will be able to update the models and further refine the results and reduce the uncertainty. And as you mentioned, we're also collaborating with the SSM, so the supervisory side of the ECB, and helping them with their supervisory climate stress test, which will happen next year. So we're giving them guidance and help in the climate scenario development, but also in collaborating in the data work, given the rich data set that we have. And the next big step is that we would like to update our framework from having a static balance sheet to a dynamic balance sheet assumption. So in the next phase, which will happen in the second quarter next year, we will allow banks to react to the higher climate risk of firms which are in their portfolios, so that they can change the portfolio compositions and react accordingly. And this will bring some second round effects to the real economy in the stress test.
Sounds exciting. And I know I'm going to follow this up with Doug. So you've heard how things are going to go next year with the ECB. From a banker's perspective, what are your expectations for this, for how this moves forward? Meaning, what would you like the regulators to use the stress testing results for? How do you want them to use these results for?
Yeah, good question. I think well, it'll be interesting to see what they do, but I think some form of standardization would be helpful, because I think it's probably hindsight will tell, but I think it probably is quite an effective way to build capability and understanding by almost setting an exercise, and then certainly from a UK perspective, it's been like a large experiment in terms of how do you try and quantify these things in a sensible way, because there's huge limitations. And I'm looking in some of the questions in the Q&A chat, and there's some good points in there around the numbers of different models that sort of are required from the full chain, from the IPCC global circulation models all the way through to your credit models. It's a huge layer of sort of complexity and assumptions. So I think some form of standardization would be enormously helpful to the banks in order that they can focus sort of effort and resource in the right way. And then probably linked to that, like we've spoken about, what would be the expectations around how this is to be used within the regulatory capital space, because that's certainly what you'd expect the direction of travel to be.
Thank you, Doug. And these are all fairly standard questions that I've heard from other bankers around standardization. It's just hard to compare across when there is no standardization, even with things like ESG ratings, for example. And the capital question is a very good one. We're used to Basel II, where we've used historical data and very robust statistical analysis, I'd like to think, to determine our capital. With climate risk, where there is no historical data, how do you look at the robustness of the analytics, and how do you set that capital? So let me just pivot to Martim here. We've heard the EU perspective from a what about the rest of the world? What are some of the leading banks globally doing around this space?
Obviously, it's driven by the bank's exposure to the topic. So, for example, the Japanese banks are quite active because they feel themselves more exposed to climate change. But it's also driven by the regulators themselves. So, for example, both Australia and New Zealand are producing legislation and asking banks to provide information, to provide some exercises. So in that sense, the the activities are not particularly different from what is going on in Europe. It has slightly different focus, more towards the physical risk, more towards the emissions, depending a little bit on the territories. And of course, there are some territories that tend to be more mature on looking at risk in general, that also tend to be the ones that in the forefront in climate risk. So territories like Canada, Australia, as I mentioned, Japan. Interesting, Brazil seems to be also catching up on the topic. All in all, we go. The story goes back to the same. I mean, we have to understand how to relate your data with the external data and the climate data, and model the impacts, and have a strategy, and understand how you will decarbonize and how we will face the climate events.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Martin, for that. Let me, you know what, let's do another survey, and then we'll get to some audience questions. I know we've got quite a few audience questions, and I want to get to those. Some great questions. So let's do a survey first. And Doug talked about, you know, the models, and I want to ask, and this is something that I'm personally interested in as well. So our survey question is with regards to lending models. You know, your PD, LGD, typical stuff that you've been using for climate risk, right? The lending models for climate risk. How do you intend to use these going forward? Are you going to use existing models and just recalibrate them for longer timeframes, perhaps? Are you building a new set of statistical models to incorporate climate risk factors into your PDs and LGDs specifically? Are you using judgmental overlays for the time being? And this is a very, very popular approach globally because of, again, issues like the lack of data, historical data on a lot of these events, a lack of data for some of the transition risk, um, some of the transition risk pathways that we think are going to happen in the future but have never happened in the past, of course, for the very, very long time frames being, you know, 30 years, 50 years in some cases. And so people, banks are using judgment to judgmental overlays to lend money. So I'll give you a few more seconds to put in your answers, and then let's take a look. Let's take a look at the results. And we're getting some questions on models as well from our audience. So this would be interesting to see before we go into audience questions. Just another maybe 5 seconds. All right. So here's the results. Using judgmental overlays mostly, and using existing models mostly, but of course there's a don't know. So let me, you know what? Let me, Doug. Let's start with you. A quick round. Is this a surprise to you? Anything here that's surprising?
No, I don't think so. I think it reflects certainly the thought process we're going through. Like you said, I mean, it's sort of going all the way to the statistical models feels almost sort of impossible at the moment. And you know, we know we want to get to some form of quantitative assessment, but you need to go on that kind of journey there.
Martin, Tina, any comments from you on this? Anything interesting? Anything surprising for you?
No surprises. I mean, I would bet on this kind of balance, meaning the judgmental overlay for the time being as the top approach, followed very closely by the recalibration of the existing. I mean, I have interacted with a few banks that are now looking on how the models they already have, try to recalibrate them in face of climate metrics and emissions metrics, right? So how PDs would evolve if you include some of the typical climate metrics, temperature, floods, so on and so forth. Some of those experiments are mostly in how, still like experiments, and the judgmental is the one that typically is published.
Very good. So let me go to some of our audience questions, and kind of related to the conversation we just had, Tina, let me go to you first. We have a question that says, what are some of the main metrics being stress tested within the banks? Cash flows, NPLs, what are you guys planning at the ECB?
So in terms of the indicators stress tested, we focus mainly on probability of default and also loss given default and expected losses on the bank side. And for the firms, we also focus on probabilities of default.
Very good, thank you. And so this is something, I guess, for all three of you. We have an interesting question, again, dealing with integration. How can we integrate climate risk with other financial risks, such as market and credit risk? How can we quantify it and affect the exposure of the clients? Like, how do you see this being integrated? Martin, 1 minute, and then I want to go to Doug and Tina.
Well, one way is obviously, I mean, as Tina was already pointing out, as you know, when you estimate losses or when you estimate capital, typically you take into consideration PD and LGD, and by incorporating the climate on those, you obviously have a way to understand how climate impacts capital and how climate might impact losses, priority to losses, as it's been clear on the webinar already. But yes, that's the logic. Now, not forget market risk. I mean, so credit risk is being followed very closely by market risk and how that is also being impacted.
Doug, how do you see this rolling out?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of taking a step back from the pure sort of scenario analysis side of things, there's a kind of interesting first step that you have to go through is deciding how you're going to structure climate within your overall risk frameworks, you know, so your sort of EWRMF framework or however it's set up, because there's kind of a, you know, the sort of philosophically correct answer is it's a cross-cutting risk. It affects, which is what the link to the question, it affects absolutely everything. And it's because of that's why it's one of the challenges about, you know, for banks to absorb climate in, because it's not something that you can just give to a sort of little team and say, right, go off and do climate risk. It's you know, affects everyone in their day job. So it's incrementally across the whole bank. But having said that, for exactly that reason, that is quite a difficult step to make in one go. So it may be that actually you can look at, and this is certainly the route that we went down, almost having a sort of temporary creation of climate risk as its own risk stripe to just support with that embedding out across the more traditional ones like credit, market risk, operational risk, and so on, reputational risk as well, clearly.
Exactly. And Tina, I know you mentioned, you know, you're looking at PD, LGD, expected loss, standard credit risk measures. Are you at the ECB looking at the other types of risk and the impact of climate on those, like market and operational?
So for the time being, actually not. So we're focusing mainly on credit risk, but it's not excluded that in the future this can be extended, the framework can be extended to include other type of risk.
Thank you. And we've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to ask one last question. You know, we have a question here on if you had to do this again, right? What enhancements, what developments, how would you do it differently? You know, for the next iteration of, let's say, a stress testing exercise. Tina, let's start with you. While I have you on your data work, how would you do it differently? What is the main lesson that you learned from this exercise?
So in terms of the main lessons learned, I would say that it's very important in terms of the data, from the data perspective, that the consistency on the one hand, so really making sure that the data that is collected is has the same standard and is exhaustive to capture all type of climate risk. And on the other hand, well, I would say that basically, yeah, as I said, there's no other additional learning for now.
Thank you. Martin, what are the top 2 or 3 lessons that banks are learning after they do stress testing that you've seen?
Well, I think that they learned that the data is a bigger challenge that they were initially anticipating. They also learned that for now they might have to live with some statistical models to do some of the correlation between the data and their portfolios. Hopefully that will evolve in a way that as data gets more detailed and more let's say available, things can evolve to a degree of occurrency, a different degree of occurrency. But I think that's probably the 2 biggest lessons. Yeah.
Thank you. And Doug, I'll give you the last word on this one. What were your top 2 lessons from that exercise?
Yeah, I mean, so not so much from the perspective of what would I have done differently, because I think that's sort of one question, but I think more the sort of what did we learn in terms of how can we evolve and improve. So I think there's sort of one is an industry issue, which is the stuff around we can't have a single question where we don't say data. So, but there is. So it's how is an industry, and that goes beyond the financial sector, do we improve the quality and the depth of the emissions data? Especially going down into sort of smaller businesses. I saw a question in the panel which was around, the kind of property, plant, and equipment of corporates. So you can't really understand the physical risk to corporates unless you really understand their PPE footprint. And there isn't really data sets out there that do that. There's some that are getting a little bit the way there, but the challenge is not only knowing where the property, plant, equipment is, but what value it adds to the business, so that you can assess what the impact of the physical impact would be. There's also big challenges around assessing sort of, it's also a very topical point at the moment, kind of supply chain disruption. So, those are things that we can't just solve as a bank, but you kind of have to just understand the limitations of it. In terms of what stuff that we can do, I think it comes back to this point about being, okay, almost sort of saying, right, okay, rather than falling within the framework of a specific regulatory stress test, let's think about what actually adds value. So I think again, not that the reg stress test doesn't add value, but I think what's particularly useful is start looking at potentially different time horizons, different approaches to the analysis, whether is top-down good enough for a kind of portfolio group-wide assessment, but you really want the granular analysis when you're looking at sectoral deep dives. That kind of flexibility and ability to sort of support the front line in the decision making is where I'd like to see things move to.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you to the rest of our panel as well. It looks like this is all we have time for today. I know this is a hot topic and we can talk about this for much longer, so hopefully you'll join us for future sessions. Tina, Doug, Martin, thank you for speaking today and sharing your experience and knowledge with the audience, and thank you for the audience for your participation. And before you close your browser, please do stay on for an extra minute or so to fill out the survey. This is available on your console already and will pop out for you once the webinar has concluded. I hope you enjoyed today's panel and have a great rest of your day.